All right, let's get started. My name is Venk Shukla, and I'm the volunteer in chief for TIE. TIE is a volunteer organization. It started about 22 years ago, and de- depends on the composition of the audience. Uh, if a lot of people have not heard the story, then I give the long version of it. Otherwise, I give the short version of it. So so please, if this is the first time you have come to a Thai event, would you please raise your hand? One, two, okay. So very few. Okay, all right. So in that case, I'll give you the short version of what we do. So this organization exists uh, is for two reasons really: to provide a networking platform for its members, and two is to foster entrepreneurship. And people who join this organization have some interest in entrepreneurship, either in terms of helping entrepreneurs or those who want to become entrepreneur or who want to be associated with entrepreneurs. That's the purpose and mission of this organization. The We organize you see about 40 to 45 events during the year, and all these events you see are free for the members. By the way, how many people here are members of TIE? Okay, well, that's a pretty good number. Okay, that's a pretty good number. So those who are not, please take note that we organize about 40 to 50 such events, with good food and wine and all those things that goes with it, as well as if you get a discount. You see about discount of about $100 in your 100 or 150 for a TiCon. 150, yes. So the entire membership due is actually is a you can it's deducted this year against your TICON fee. So it's a pretty good value. And the reason we do that is really because this organization is about helping entrepreneurs and fostering the cause of entrepreneurship. The kind of activity that we organize really are in about 4 or 5 categories. One is inspiring. We inspire people to become entrepreneurs. So we have this series called My Story, where successful entrepreneurs come and talk about their own personal journey. Then there are events, you see, which we call educational events. So different special interest groups organize their own events on areas of technology like big data, cloud, mobility, and so on and so forth. Finally, and then there are events, you see, which are about mentoring. So we have one event coming up, you see, on Thursday, where you can sign up, you see, and choose from among the mentors, you see, who agreed to come that day. So there are mentoring sessions also, and the big mentoring sessions we have is here during the TICON. The fourth category of activities we do fall in the category of funding. We have two funding programs. One is TIE Angels, which meets third Monday of every month, which gives money see, for to promising entrepreneurs. And then there is a accelerator called TIE Launchpad, just on the other side of the wall. And the final this activity that we do is networking. So we organize networking mixers where you can exchange cards, you can meet each other. We also organize events like Find Your Co-founder, where you can come and talk about what you're doing and look for people you see of similar interests who may want to join you. So these are some of the activities that we do. We also organize, you see, events like today's, and which really strictly don't fit in any bucket, except you see these are the kind of things that would be of relevant and value to people you see who are thinking of doing their own startup. And we have an outstanding speaker today, and I just want to give you a background you see of our speaker today. Our speaker today is a founder and managing partner of Leadership Pathways, an organizational consulting and leadership development firm dedicated to helping organizations with bold visions achieve sustainable high performance and industry leadership. As an organization effectiveness and executive development consultant, he has more than 30 years of experience assisting executives and managers in business, government, and education. So it's a privilege that he has chosen to come here and share his insight with us. He has designed and led over 100 seminars and workshops for leaders. And he is, he received his PhD from Harvard in 1985, where his studies span the field of human and organization development. He is author of 5 books on human and organizational change, and they include, and he's going to talk about it from this book today, The Golden Flame, The Heart and Soul of Remarkable Leadership. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Merron.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And give me a moment, I'm going to set this up properly. I think before I forget, that's my job. And then I should have had this on. You've all seen this before, I'm sure. There we go. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, especially Giants are playing tonight, and I don't know how many of you are Giants fans. My guess is not many, or you'd be home watching your Giants fans. So for those of you who may be Giants fans, please do not announce the score of the game, because if you're a Giants fan, you're probably taping it. But the rest of you here, probably not a Giants fan. I'm a in-betweener, but I'm delighted to be here. I want you to know that I start off this conversation with a very specific bend and a very specific interest. I have no idea why this is true, but my whole life I've been fascinated by greatness. All the books that I write focus on what does it take to become masterful in one's field. I'm fascinated by that subject. I think years ago I started to reflect on this, why am I so interested in it? And I came to the realization it's partly my own desire to find my own greatness. And then you can ask why that, and you'll look at my parents and demanding childhood and all that, and you'll find some answers to it. But I'm fascinated by what it takes to become great. And so in the area of leadership, which is the primary area of focus that has been my whole adult career, I've been fascinated by what does it take to become an extraordinary leader. And I'm going to be talking with you about that. And I'm going to tell you right now that this topic is going to be only interesting to you if you're interested in creating a great organization. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs, when they start their companies, that's not necessarily the question that they're asking. They want to do some good, they want to make some money, they want to get the product out the door. But becoming a great and extraordinary organization is too far down the road for a lot of these organizations. And yet, I'm going to suggest and talk about the very things that cause an organization to become great may also be the very things that enable you to get beyond the startup phase. I know you all know the statistics well more than I. I think it's something like 1 in 5 organizations actually get through and make it beyond the startup phase, or 1 in 5 make it beyond 2 years, or something like that. I don't know what the exact statistics are. But we're going to be talking about what does it take to get beyond the startup phase. The paradox is, a lot of you, if you're in this organization, are thinking about, no, how do I get through this stage? I'm not thinking about beyond it, I just want to get through it, and you're in that stage. So we'll be exploring that together. And I'm going to be talking about some of the contents in this book that was a body of research that I did. So hang on a sec, let's see. That's not it. I'm going to have to do it this way. There we go. So what we're going to be doing is thinking on some things. I'm going to be offering you my perspective, but inviting you to find your own perspective on this subject. And part of the question is, what is your goal? If your goal is to build to sell, you may not be interested in what we're going to talk about. Although, like I said before, I believe that the very same things that I'm going to be sharing with you are crucial to making it through the startup phase. So let me define startup. I was in with these fellas over here, and we were talking about, well, what is the startup phase and what is after the startup phase? I'm going to offer you a model. This is a model that many of you have probably seen some variations of. This particular model comes from the work of Ichak Adizes, who's written a number of books about the natural phases of the life cycle of an organization. And basically, all organizations follow an S-curve, just like all living organisms follow an S-curve. It's a natural cycle from birth, growth, maturity, decay, and death. You and I, in this bodily form, will follow that life cycle. All living organisms follow it. It seems to be also true of all products, or all business models, or all organizations. They follow roughly the same phases. So again, this may not be new, but it'll help us define our terms. And, oh, sorry, I'm going to go back there a little bit. So these are universal principles, and what happens is that each phase that I'm going to describe has a set of requirements. If you don't meet the requirements of the phase, you get to premature death as an organization. Much like life, if you're a child and you don't get the milk that you need or the early nourishment you need, you will likely not make it into 3 or 4 or 5 years old. At 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years old, you have to learn how to walk, you have to learn how to talk, and you have to learn how to deal with certain challenges. And if you don't, you might get into an accident and die a premature death. So organizations go through these phases much like products and human beings. And in these phases, there are key activities and responsibilities that are the keys to growth. So in the first phase, the formulation phase, this is the startup phase. And in the startup phase, you're just scrambling to get funding. Now, funding could be outside funding, or it could be your own money that you're from your own pocket, you're funding the business. If you're young, it could be parents' money or family money. But whatever it is, you need something early on to get the thing going. Sometimes the funding is sweat equity. It's actually not money, but it's working really hard in your garage on the side. You're funding the business because it doesn't have a revenue stream. You're looking to identify who's the target market. Typically, if you're starting up a company, you already know this is the market I'm going after. And you already have a sense that I'm building a product or service that is better than those other products or services that are out there in the market. And that's why I'm doing it. I think there's a hole in the market. There's an opportunity, and I'm going to seize that opportunity with a better product or better service. And this defines, in some sense, the early phase of a startup. And what you're doing in this phase, you're scrambling to get the money or time to develop the product, and then you're putting it out there to see whether or not the market wants it. And if the market wants it, if you've succeeded, and there's a demand for the product or service, now you get to play a little more. And now you get to go to the next phase. And interestingly, in this particular phase, as you can see on the right-hand side, what's needed is you need an enormous amount of determination and faith. You need a team of people to work with you, usually, and that team ought to be putting in sweat equity with you. And you need at least some kind of underlying value system. You don't need to have big, strong value statements in the organization, but something that's going to hold the organization together a little bit. If you succeed and you, in this phase, you then get to play some more and you go into early growth. This is where you've got to develop some kind of reliable system so that if the product works out there in the market, you've got to repeat it. And so putting one product out there or one service and testing it with one customer isn't enough. You're going to have other customers coming to you who want this thing, hopefully, and therefore you better start to develop repeatable systems. This is what you and I were talking about, your example. It didn't have that repeatability in the system, and it caved in part as a result. You've got to stretch the boundaries some to offer perhaps new products and new markets. And in this particularly early growth phase, you've got to be really adaptable. Because what you thought is going to work at the beginning of the phase may not work in the market, and then you've got to adjust. How do I know this? one of the things that the person who introduced me spoke about is my background. I've been consulting to organizations for over 30 years, and I've worked with over 400 different companies in my career. I work with tiny companies that are in the startup phase who believe in what we're going to be talking about today. And I've worked with some of the top organizations in the world. American Express, IBM, Apple Computer, Hewlett-Packard are among some of my clients. And I've worked with some of the leadership of these clients over many, many years. And I work with small. And I want you to know, and I will tell this to my big company clients, I prefer working with smaller companies. And the reason why I prefer it, and this is going to be one of the punchlines for this evening's talk, is it's a lot easier to create a culture than it is to change one. If when you're starting the organization, you have some thought about the quality of the culture you're trying to create, you have some thought about what is the foundation of this business, that when we get larger and when we succeed, it can recreate itself with integrity and value. If you have some thought at the beginning, it will be a lot easier to sustain that business than if you try to change a wrecked culture. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I prefer to create cultures than I do to change them. I'll give you one more piece of my qualifications before I talk some more. While I was at Harvard University, my doctoral advisor was a guy by the name of Terry Deal. Some of you may have heard of him, but Terry Deal is a guy that wrote the book Corporate Cultures. It came out in 1982 along with the book In Search of Excellence, and they were two huge bestsellers in the business community. Basically, the book Corporate Cultures put the concept of corporate culture on the map in the world, in the business community. He was my advisor, so I got in on the ground floor of this whole idea of looking at organizations as cultures. So a lot of the things that you hear about and talk about in terms of leadership, participatory management, the importance of vision, the importance of values, all of those things we were exploring 35 years ago when I was a doctoral student, wondering about what does it take to create great organizations. And I've probably done more culture change, culture growth work than just about anybody on the planet because I got in on the ground floor studying with Terry Deal. So that's a little bit, I'm not so comfortable talking about my background and qualifications. I just like to let the content of what I'm speaking stand on its own, but that background I want you to know I've worked with these many companies. And there's a pattern that started to emerge for me in working with so many companies that I'm going to share with you about what causes startups to actually get to the next phase and beyond. I'm not going to be helpful. How do you start up a company? And interesting, we were again talking on this table. When you're just starting out, most people can't even think about leadership and can't think about culture. You're thinking about getting the darn product together, building it, getting it out in the market. But somewhere right after that, right after the startup, right after the formulation phase, when you're in early growth, when you start to think about repeatability, if you succeed in this phase, what's going to happen is this. You will go into late and hopefully rapid growth, and by now you're 50, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 1,000 people. And if you have not established the foundation in the culture from your leadership, if you have the good fortune of getting to that phase and you haven't done that, you will die an early death. I'm telling you from my experience of hundreds of companies, the organizations that think about this and care about it, they don't die an early death. They get to sustain themselves into maturity, into becoming one of those major players in the industry. So again, this topic is not going to be very helpful in starting it up, but if you think about it during the startup, and if you're successful in the startup, it's crucial that you think about some of these things. So what are those things that I'm asking you to think about? Well, I'm going to blow by this real quick. This is not going to be so interesting to you. Hang on. Just a couple of pieces of information, actually, that might be quite interesting. That in this day and age, and this comes from two major bodies of research where I think it's the Kennedy School and the University of Chicago. They, every 2 years, study how satisfied are people with leadership. And they study how satisfied are they with leadership in business, in government, in the military, in medical systems, in you name it, in education. And they've been tracking this for now 50 years, every 2 years, both of these institutions. And they have found an interesting pattern that even though leadership is perhaps the most talked about subject in the area of business than any other subject, even though there's more research in leadership than just about any other subject on the planet, even though there's a fascination with leadership, you know, when we talk about who's being elected, and when we grouse about those leaders and we talk about who's a good leader and who's a bad leader, it's a fascinating subject. 6,000 books out there on the topic of leadership up until about 7 or 8 years ago. My guess is there's probably now 7,000. It is a huge topic. In spite of that huge amount of interest in leadership, over 50 years, this particular piece of research remains true, that roughly 2/3 of adults have little or no confidence in their leaders. What we're going to talk about in terms of leadership is going to make that piece of data make sense. And this research cuts across all industries, and it's now been true for over 40 years. This is a little bit dated. So if I were to ask you, what are the qualities that make up great leadership? You would say some of these things. You would say probably vision. You would say, think about it for a moment. I'll actually not reveal all this, but think about it. What are the qualities that make up great leadership? Just off the top of your head. Let me hear a couple. Aside from seeing the big picture and vision, what does it take?
Do the right thing.
What?
Credibility.
Credibility.
Do the right thing.
Doing the right thing. Integrity. What else does? Honesty.
Planning.
Perseverance. Absolutely.
Serving.
Serving. Okay, great. Seem familiar? Knowledge? Yeah. Intelligence? Seem familiar? All those things that listed so far make sense? Absolutely. Every single group of people that I speak with, when I ask what does it take to become a good leader, they'll name these same things. And so, here they are. You already named them. Focus is also one of them. Drive and determination, passion, courage, et cetera, et cetera. So, one other thing about me that is useful to know. I've been consulting, as I mentioned, to over 400 companies in the past 30 some odd years. Yeah? You want to add one more?
No, what you showed is what people want to see in their leaders.
Yes.
Not necessarily how people get to be a leader.
That's exactly what we're going to discuss.
Okay.
That's exactly what we're going to discuss. You read my book, and he's my friend. He's here to. Anyway, so yes. These things, no matter who I'm with, I ask that question. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I will go back to my thought. So here was what I was saying. I have been working with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pretty good leaders. I've worked with hundreds of executives. I've coached at least 30 CEOs, maybe more in my career. These are pretty darn good quality leaders. About 7 or 8 years ago, I woke up, I was sweating like I am now. It's awfully hot in here, or maybe I'm hot because I'm wearing a jacket. I woke up one day and I had this sudden realization that even though I've worked with now hundreds and hundreds of leaders in my career, I had not met one great leader in my life. Now you could say my standard was way too high, and I think that's probably true. Like I told you at the beginning, I'm fascinated by mastery. I'm fascinated by greatness. And in that fascination, nobody's going to meet my standard of excellence. So that's part of it. Or you can argue that there aren't that many great leaders out there. And depending on how you define great leadership, I think that could be true. I'm going to define it in a little bit. So anyway, I woke up with this disturbing realization that I didn't know any great leaders. And I decided I would go on a journey. And I would seek and find and meet and spend time with great leaders. And that's exactly what I did for 2 years. So my criteria for selecting this is they had to be a leader of an organization that is doing something unique in their industry. They had to be the CEO, executive director, leader of this business. And the quality of the organization, its culture, its success needs to be directly connected to that leadership. In other words, you could be the head of IBM, and you could have just been hired as the head of IBM yesterday. Its success is not due to you. It's due to the prior leaders. So the quality of the organization had to have something to do with the leaders. I set out to seek and find these leaders. So I sent an email to a bunch of folks that I knew, about, I think, 50 or 75 people. I can't remember exactly how many, a ton of them. And I said, this is the criteria. Who do you know that's a great leader that meets that criteria?
I'm going to ask you, why is number one even important?
Because of my fascination. It's not that important. It doesn't have to be. That's something I wanted. I'm fascinated by people who make a dent in the world in a way that's unique and different. But you don't have to have it as your criteria of leadership. Good question. So I sent the email out and I said, who do you know? And you know what I got? I got a bunch of emails back saying, I don't know of anybody who met that criteria. It's a pretty high, tall order. But fortunately, out of the 50 or 75 that I sent out, and you need to know I'm connected probably 2 degrees of separation from Obama. I mean, I'm pretty connected out there in the world. But I got very, very few. Fortunately, 15 emails came back and said, oh, I know so-and-so. I'd like to introduce you to that person. That person is a great leader. And I was on my journey. I then, after meeting with these 15, I also, more and more people came to my awareness. And I ended up talking with 36 extraordinary leaders from all different walks of life who met these criteria, who are doing something unique. And the employees would say, this organization is to a large extent a direct result of this person's leadership. Yes, sir.
In your sample, were they all hired CEOs or the founding of the very successful CEOs, like Bill Gates or Bob Geldof?
They were a mix. They were a mix. That wasn't one of my criteria. That didn't matter to me.
But does experience show there may be a difference? Once you build the organization, once you are hired to do something.
Yes, it could be. There could be some differences. Yeah. So, some of the folks that I met, Chauncey Starr, who I'm going to talk about. Chauncey's a fascinating leader. Judith Regala, Guy Jordan of C.R. Barr, James Thrall, head of the radiology department, Larry Flick. A lot of these people you may not know of personally. I did not know many of these folks. Interestingly, the sample size that I ended up with are not leaders of major organizations. There are very few big organizational leaders, which led me to wonder, what does it take to become a great leader of a large organization? It may not be the same as what it takes to be smaller. But a lot of these are founding organizations that are doing something fascinating. Mimi Silbert, I'll speak with you about in a little bit. Absolutely fascinating. The CEO of the Republic of Tea, wonderful man. So these are just a few examples, and I'm going to be talking about it. Oh, I just spoke with Gordon Gunn today. This is kind of frustrating. Okay, there we go. So I had a clicker and the battery's out, so I'm losing this particular effect. It would be helpful, actually, if somebody would be willing to sit here and, would you? Thank you. It would speed up our conversation quite a bit. You just hold the function button, FN, and then press the down button, just whenever I signal that. So let's make the connection. I'm there in search of great leaders. I'm trying to understand what is the essence of great leadership. And what this gentleman asked is exactly what I was interested in. Not so much what are the qualities of great leadership. We all know that. But I was asking, what is it that causes some leaders to become great and others not? And we're going to connect this back to the question of what does it take to lead a startup into the next phase, because I think they are inextricably intertwined. So I'm going to start with Chauncey Starr. Chauncey Starr is one of the favorite leaders I've ever known. Any of you ever hear of Chauncey Starr? Okay, you will know him from this talk. He was the founder of EPRI, Electrical Power Research Institute. Anybody hear of that? Okay, good. He was the founder of EPRI. Chauncey, when I met him, is a 93-year-old guy. He was the CEO emeritus of the company. And here's what's fascinating about Chauncey that I want to imprint in your brain. 93-year-old man, and he still was working full-time. Now here's a guy that started, EPRI, the Electrical Power Research Institute, was founded on the idea that most electricity is a commodity. You plug in your plug into the electrical socket here or in Switzerland or in India, you get the same thing. And by definition, commodities, in order to be successful as a business, you end up having to care a lot about efficiency and bringing the price point down. There's not a lot of effort that says, how do we build better electricity? It's the same stuff that was in the sockets 70, 80 years ago. Is this working now? Oh, wonderful, thank you. That works. So most electrical utility industries don't put much money into R&D because building a better electricity is not what the world necessarily wants. The world does want, how do we build cleaner electricity, but not necessarily better electricity. It does what it does. And so it's a commodity. Very little money in R&D, which means the same coal shoveling operations, the same way in which we develop electricity has been around for 60, 70, or 80 years, and there's very little investment that goes into changing that. Chauncey had this realization 40 years ago and said, wait a sec, what do we do about this problem? Because electricity is very costly to produce and costly to our environment. What do we do about that? He formed the Electrical Power Research Institute, and the idea was that let's see if we can create a collaborative effort. Bring all of the electrical utilities together, and if each pours 1% of its money into a pool of R&D and we pool that effort, that body of money can be quite substantial to fuel R&D. And Electrical EPRI has probably more than any other organization advanced the nature of the way in which we produce electricity than any other institution. And the whole concept of green energy was developed here, among other places. So that's Chauncey Starr. He's developed this successful, huge, life-changing organization in his time, 93 years old, already made a success, and yet he's still working full-time. Why would a person spend their whole life and then at age 93 still work full-time? Well, the answer is kind of obvious. The answer is kind of obvious. He had a passion. He cared deeply about it. The COO of the organization, who I knew at the time is a guy that I play golf with now, I asked him, why does Chauncey work? He says, because he doesn't want to die before he solves the energy crisis on the planet. He doesn't want to die before he solves the energy crisis on the planet. That's why he's still working full-time at age 93. That's a man with a purpose. Now, you all have heard about the term vision. You all know about vision. You've probably read things about vision. You may have your own vision. But I ask the question something deeper. What gives rise to vision? And from the research that I did with these 36 extraordinary leaders, by the way, I met these leaders. I showed you a short list. I ended up with meeting 36 leaders like Chauncey. I spent at least 2 hours with each of these leaders, and I was asking them what makes them tick. What is it that gives rise to their leadership? Why is it that they think the way they think? What caused them to be who they are? And one of the 3 answers that I want to share with you in this talk is, represented by Chauncey Starr. Every single leader I met was fueled by an inner desire to make a difference in the world. That's simple. There was a passion and a sense of purpose. Purpose, by definition, is not for one's own sake, but purpose in terms of adding value to the world. And Chauncey Starr was the poster child for me of that spirit, 93 years old, still working full time. He worked till the day he died. He died about 2 years ago at age 96 or 97 because of that, fueled by that passion. Now, I'm not recommending you do that. A lot of you have images of retirement at age 70. I will tell you, or 65 or whatever, I will tell you that one of my people that I know quite closely and work with is a guy by the name of Ken Dykewald, who is revolutionizing the way we think about retirement. And his vision, and he speaks about this all over the world, is that we get rid of the word retirement. Because when you retire, you have this thought. Give me one moment, I'll come back to you. When you retire, it's often the thought, I'm going to work hard so that then I can play hard. And most of the people that live in their retirement or their golden years most satisfactory, they didn't stop working. It may have changed a little bit, but Chauncey Starr is that poster child of, he's driven by a passion. And so his work was his passion for 40 years, and it continued to be for another 20. You have a thought or a question?
Yeah, so I've done some similar research for innovators.
Yes.
That what drove them to do big innovations.
Yes.
And so my question for you is, because it's a similar research,
Yeah.
did you inquire into the why did these guys have the desire to make the dent in the universe?
You know, I did not go that deep. That becomes an interesting, why did that care about
That's where we're going to change the
upbringing, something happened in their life where they wanted to give back. So I don't know, why does somebody have a passion and a purpose and somebody else not? That's a great question. That's another piece. No, I never got that far. But I did get far enough, yeah.
That's a basic human nature, to seek identity basically. A lot of people have passion because they want to leave a mark on the world.
I have a hypothesis that that's true. So I try to stay close to my research, but I believe that what this gentleman said is true, that we are, by our human nature, we want to give. And you can tell that. When you go and do something in the world where you give of your time or your effort, the good feeling that comes from that is apparent to almost all of us. The sad question is, why is it that some people are cut off from that desire? And that's where you have to look at your childhood and environment and some kind of catastrophic event where they end up being very egocentric. My research on this particular effort came to the clear conclusion that these leaders were hardly ever egocentric at all. They were inner driven, inner guided, but their focus was on serving the world. And you could argue it's human nature, I would agree. You have a thought, yeah?
Yeah, I think the passion is very admirable, and a lot of people have the passion. But in this case, what I'd like to know more is that he had the passion. That's great, but I think the leadership skills here. What you mentioned very briefly, that he convinced all the other companies to put 1% of
Yes.
revenue or whatever, and that to me is the leadership. Could you focus on that? How he got?
We'll get to that. So there has to be a vision and a plan. We'll get to that in a little bit.
So I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Ultimately, leadership.
By the way, is this the culture around here where you just stop and ask questions of speakers? I kind of like it.
Whatever you prefer.
I know, I like it. This is good. I may not get to the end of my talk, but we'll enjoy the journey.
Ultimately, leadership is very situational.
Share the hand out.
And the embodiments of leadership are viewed through a frame of lens
Yes.
created by a situation. And I can attest to you, I've seen so many great leaders in whose organization several segments of their own people hated working with them.
Yes.
But in the broader lens, they were deemed great leaders, including Steve Jobs, for example. So what was your frame of lens beyond the three questions?
Okay,
Because
so-
there are situations that would have made them a great leader, like Washington was, or there were crises in a company that made them a great leader, etc.
Yeah, I was asking a different set of questions. Yeah. Yeah, I think what you're saying is true. You can take one leader in a particular situation where who they are and what they bring fits the situation and magic occurs. That same leader in a different situation could do a nosedive. And so, yes, I think that's true. Not quite the question that I was asking. So, good question, but I'm going to move on a little bit. So, what I was discovering, at least in this particular body of research, is that great leaders want to leave a legacy. Whether they become great in terms of situational, a different question. And this little poem, which I love, this comes from Hawthorne, one of his psalms. Lives of great men remind us we can make our lives sublime. We can make our lives extraordinary and leave behind us footprints in the sand of time. All of these leaders had an attention to what is my legacy? What am I going to leave behind? In other words, what is my passion and purpose beyond myself? Jerry Jampolsky, also one of the leaders that I met, wonderful man. Any of you heard of Jerry Jampolsky? He founded an organization called the Institute for Attitudinal Leadership, Institute for Attitudinal Change, which has offices, about 130 offices all over the world. He was a psychiatrist who, in his 30s, 40s, he was working at a hospital. And one day he walked by the children's ward where children were dying and from cancer. And he walked into this room, and there were no doctors there, no nurses, and the kids were kind of like this, completely depressed, sad, as you can imagine. It's quite a sad thing to know you're going to die of cancer at a young age or at any age. He walks in this room, and he has this inspiration that he wants to talk with the kids. And he started to ask them questions. One of the questions he asked of one kid was, what are your dreams for your life? This kid that was going to die in a few months, all of a sudden went from this to that. Stood up, perked up. It was the first time anybody had ever asked him that question in the hospital. It's a completely counterintuitive question to ask. But he was inspired to ask that. The kid perked up and started to talk about his life. Not about his death, but about his life. And then other kids started to gather around Jerry. And he started to ask these other questions of these kids about their life. And they started to perk up. Somebody was actually interested in them. Now you can imagine, it's a pretty depressing ward to go into a hospital for kids that are dying. And a lot of the doctors were staying away. The nurses were staying away. Jerry goes right into it. And they got alive. And he started to go back every day to this hospital ward, to the point where they couldn't wait until he would come. They were buzzing about his presence and his activity and his interest in their lives. And he started to form an idea about what does it take to live an extraordinary life, learning from these children. He then quits his job as a psychiatrist. He had this huge practice, probably earning $1 million a year or something. Is wonderful, successful, one of the top psychiatrists in the Bay Area. Quits his job completely, and for 2 years doesn't earn a penny. His business, his office, goes from thriving to nothing. His money that he had saved up dwindles down to nothing. He has no idea how he's going to earn a living. He writes a book about his experience with these kids. And then, as luck would have it, the book that he wrote, which hadn't sold yet, somebody was on the Johnny Carson show, a guy by the name of Orson Bean, who was one of the regulars on the Johnny Carson show in the 60s and 70s. Orson Bean lifts up Jerry Jampolsky's book about attitudinal change and says, this book saved my life. And all of a sudden, Jerry Jampolsky, his work started to get famous. The point is, here was a man who was willing to sacrifice his whole life, his whole income, his whole job in service to these kids. And he had no idea why, other than he was inspired to do it and inspired to write this book. I'm not recommending you all live that way, and I don't know why Jerry Jampolsky was inspired in that way. He just was. And there's some leap of faith that it takes to create a company and sustain it beyond the startup that has something to do with Jerry Jampolsky and something to do with Chauncey Starr. It is that internal passion, that internal sense of, I'm doing something of meaning in the world. To put it very basely, if your goal is to make money, you won't get this. If your goal is to make a difference, and in so doing the money follows, you'll get what I'm saying quite clearly. In my estimation, you can't be a great leader if the goal is to make money. You'll make good money, but you won't necessarily be a great leader, at least in the way in which we're talking about. So another way of saying it is I'm saying these people, the 36 of them, had a clear compass. They had a sense of purpose, and they had an internal map guiding them where they wanted to go, like Jerry Jampolsky. So I'm going to talk about this guy here, Atef Mankarios. Atef is he was once the CEO of a hotel chain. I can't remember the name of the chain, but this is one of those 5-star hotels, hotel chains in the world. He was the CEO and president of it. When I met him, he was leading a consulting firm. Atef was named one of these extraordinary leaders. He moved me beyond belief, and I want to tell you a brief story about what he said. What Atef was noted for was his trustworthiness. Somebody said integrity, somebody said honesty. Something deeper is going on that I'm going to talk about. But Atef was known for his trustworthiness. And Atef said to me in my interview, he said, I wasn't always that way. I was a kind of a high-flying, hard-charging leader, like a lot of leaders, wanting to make an impact, wanting to make good money and do these great things. But something happened along the way. He said, for a number of years, he and this guy in his hotel, this fellow who was from Africa, his job was to shine the doorknobs, to dust off the lamps, to sweep the floor, and that's all he did. And he put meticulous care into what he did, this fella in his hotel. And every few days, Atef would walk by near this guy and say, hello, how you doing? Barely even knew the guy's name. The guy would say, hi, Atef, good to see you. And that was their relationship for years and years. Friendly, cordial, but no big deal. This guy didn't have a big role. He shined the doorknobs, cleaned off the bulbs, cleaned the lamps, be sure that the staircase was safe and clean. That was his job for years and years and years. One day, for whatever reason, Atef sat down in the cafeteria next to the guy, and they started to talk. And Atef was just inspired to ask a couple questions, like, tell me a little bit about yourself. I hardly know you, and here for years we've been saying hello, and that's it. Turns out that this guy, who for about 15 or 20 years that this was his job in the hotel, this guy had a PhD in chemistry from his country and a family. And he was one of the top teachers in one of the top universities in I don't know what country in Africa. And he came to the United States with a big hope and a big dream to teach in the universities here and do his chemistry work. He had a PhD. He was a brilliant man. But when he got here at a time, for whatever reason, it was a recession or a difficult time, and he couldn't find a job in his chosen profession. And he had his family with him. And at some point, he gave up the search, and he said, I have to get some job, any job, to satisfy the needs of my family. And so he did. He got a job sweeping floors and toiling away in the hotel, in this particular hotel for 15, 20 years. Never complained about it because what he was doing was contributing to his family. Atef was moved to tears hearing the story of this man who so humbly, even though he was so bright and talented, so humbly said, I'm going to just take this job to contribute to my family. This is all I can do. Now, who knows what else was going on? I don't know, maybe he wasn't that capable. But the point is, Atef saw this light bulb went off in his mind. He said, I walk past people who are in my employ and I don't even know who they are. And he made a decision. It was kind of a sacred choice with himself. No longer am I going to walk past people and not know who they are. No longer am I going to walk past without having a heart-to-heart connection with the people that I work with. And so was born a sense of his own integrity. He became trustworthy as a leader and an extraordinary leader because of his heart connection, because of a choice he made around a value that kind of emerged for him in that moment. And ever since then, he kept his promise, not just to this gentleman, but to everybody else in his employ, and became known as an aspiring leader who was extraordinarily trustworthy. So these things that we're talking about, this passion, this connected to a deeper sense of who we are, results in vision, strategic ability, focus and determination. All these things that we would say have something to do with great leadership are born out of that inner compass. Why did Atef have that realization? Who knows? Why did it show up for him at that time? I have no idea, nor does Atef. But that guidance system, that inner guidance system. I'll say one more thing. There's a client I'm working with right now, and this connects directly to this subject. Client I'm working with right now, he's a founder of a company. It has about 100 employees. It's in the high-tech area. It is funded by 3 people, himself and 2 venture-backed firms. The venture firms are telling him, speed up, speed up, speed up. We've got to get this product in an accelerated mode. We've got to get the big play here. Such and such, one of your competitors just got bought out by Microsoft and got $1 billion, and we're losing the market opportunity. If he follows the guidance of the venture capitalists, and I apologize if there are any venture capitalists in the room, if he follows the guidance of the venture capitalists, he will not be true to himself. He's trying to build a company designed to last. His focus is on his customers. His focus is on making a difference in the young people that work with his particular technology. And he believes that if he grows it too fast and follows the lead of the venture capitalists, it will topple over. Now, whether you agree with that or not, it doesn't matter. The point is he's sticking with his sense of integrity. He's sticking with his inner compass, and he's telling the venture capitalists, I'm sorry, you may want me to put my foot on the gas pedal twice as fast, I'm not going to do it. This is a leader that I believe is going to lead an organization of substance and value, but it may not be as fast as the venture capitalists want. All right, I want to say something about Mimi Silbert. I'm going to speed through this in a little bit because Mimi Silbert is an interesting topic. How many of you heard of Mimi Silbert? Nobody. Any of you hear of Delancey Street Restaurant in San Francisco? A few of you, okay. Meaningful, Mimi Silbert is meaningful for the following reason. Mimi Silbert had an idea about 35 years ago. She founded an organization called the Delancey Street Foundation. And her idea was simply this, that people who are in prisons, who are felons, we don't give them a chance when they get out of the prison. They get marked for life as felons. And it's very hard for them to get back into society. And so what happens is they come back here, they get a pretty difficult time of it. They end up feeling defeated, and they go back to whatever it is that caused them to be a felon in the first place. she decides she wants to do something different, and she wants to create an environment where felons, drug dealers, drug addicts, leaders of gangs, where they can actually be in a family. And she creates this little, she invites them to her apartment. She formed this little house where they could live, and they all worked together under her guidance. They started a restaurant called Delancey Street. And all the people in Delancey Street, this is a wonderful restaurant right near Pac Bell Park in the city. It's a wonderful restaurant. If you go there, you'll get wonderful Mediterranean food. What you wouldn't know when you go there is that all the waiters, all the waitresses, the host and the hostess, the people who park your cars, the manager of the organization, the people who cook your food, the office manager, they're all former felons who have been in prisons for 20 years. You wouldn't know it. They live there, serve your food, and it feels like you're being served a wonderful meal by these wonderful people who are in society living and breathing a healthy life. And the reason why they're doing it is because they're all part of this community. It's kind of a collective, cooperative that she created, where they're all supporting each other, she's supporting them, and they're doing good work in the world. They now have 7 businesses, at least up until 3 or 4 years ago when I spoke last to Mimi. They have a Christmas tree business. They have a moving company. They have the restaurant. They have they have a framing business. To date, there have been 14,000 people who have been through and part of Delancey Street. They built, with their own hands, they built one of the most beautiful apartment complexes in San Francisco, right across the street from Pac Bell Park. Everything they do, the work that they do, the place that they live, was all built by these people who were former felons, in prisons for 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. She lives among them. And the first thing, when I went there to interview her assistant, who was also a former felon, she, by the way, was not. But her assistant, I said, why is so many people so fascinated by Mimi? What is it about her? She said, we all want to be like Mimi. When I interviewed Mimi to ask her what makes her tick, she said the following, and it's this simple. She says, I have a few rules. These rules are inviolable. If you want to be part of my family, part of my community, part of this, you live by these rules no matter what. And if you don't live by these rules, you get kicked out. And everybody in this organization, these 14,000 people, know these rules by heart, they live by them, or they're not here. And I will not move from these rules. That stance, I will not move. I will lose my business over it. I will lose everything over it. These are my rules. That's Mimi. She did it with a smile on her face. She did it with joy, but they were clear. Mimi's rules were rather simple. Each one teach one. That is, whatever you learn, you pass on to somebody else. So you are a learner and your teacher in this organization. One of other Mimi's rules were, you take responsibility for your actions, no matter what. A third rule was, you don't touch anybody here. You don't hit, you don't hurt anybody. Now, whatever you did in prison, whatever you did out there, you don't touch and you don't threaten anybody physically. These are simple rules. There were rules that you and I would live by, I would hope, very naturally. But the population of people that she works with wouldn't necessarily live by those rules at all. But they get, you come to this institution, you become part of this community, this family, live in this apartment, you follow those rules. They were Mimi's rules. So Betsy Bernard was another example, and I can go on and on and on. I'm just giving you a few examples. Every single person that I spoke with, these 36 leaders, they had their rules and they were immovable. One guy who was listed on here before, I won't mention his name, he was a potential future president of the United States, and he ruined his political career because he was not going to back down on his sense of integrity in front of the President of the United States. He hurt his career severely by holding on to his values, and he didn't bat an eye because his values were more important than his ambitions. Another guy, who I won't mention his name, was spending 20 years in his adult life climbing the ladder. He always wanted to be the head of a major corporation. He got to become president of the major corporation, and he was about to be hired as the CEO. This was of a $3 billion business. He was about to be given about $100 million, kind of a signing bonus, a bunch of stock in the company to become CEO, but it came with a catch. He had to do something that in his mind violated his integrity. And he walked away from the company. He walked away from the position that he had been working toward for 20 years to start his own company. Again, I won't mention the name of the person because he preferred to be kept silent about this. But you can feel Mimi's rules in this. So it gives rise to this second feature that I think is crucial to leadership. And that is anchored in your values. We all have values. Many of us can articulate them. But the point is that when you can say to me and to your employees, this is immovable. This particular value, this particular standard, this particular expectation, if you want to play in this sandbox with me, this does not move. When you're a person that can say it that clearly, that firmly, that's what gives rise to trust. And from that trust, people will follow you. People will work with you. People will want to be inspired by you. These people, they were immovable and it was impeccable. And there was a deep sense of caring, just like at TEF. Caring for the product, caring for what the product or service does in the world, and caring for the people in the organization. This results in what we call integrity. Integrity, the root word of integrity has something to do with integrated. To be integrated means to be connected to oneself. So again, I'm not poo-pooing the value of making money or good products or interesting things, but if it's not done connected to who you are, you will likely not show up in a way that others will be inspired. It results in trustworthiness, it results in courage, it results in determination and drive and care. So I want to talk about this guy. This guy's Bannis Hudson. Any of you know about Bannis Hudson? No. That's a good guess. Lens Crafters and Bevmo. He was, when Lens Crafters was a small organization with a few stores, and it was crippled financially and about to go out of business, he was called in to lead Lens Crafters. He led it from there to be over 100 stores throughout the country and put Lens Crafters on the map. He then left Lens Crafters. You all know of Lens Crafters, yes? Yeah. And then eventually became CEO of Bevmo, Beverages and More. You have seen of that place? He took that over when it was a crippled organization and about to go bankrupt to become quite a quality organization. It took about 7 years. When I met Bannis, I loved Bannis. Bannis, I'm sure he's a multi-millionaire. I'm sure he's worth 15, 20, 30, $50 million. I'm sure of it. When I met him, when he was an extremely wealthy man, I walked in his office. His office was about this size, from here to here. There were no pictures on the walls of presidents and kings. There was no awards on the walls. There was no fancy desk. It was a simple laminate desk with a metal chair for a seat. It was extremely modest for a CEO of that kind standard. When I went in, he said, "Hello, I'm Bannis. Come on in. Can I get you something to drink?" Now, usually I'm expecting with a CEO of a billion-dollar company, I'm expecting the assistant to get me something to drink, and I'm expecting this big office. None of that. He walked to the water cooler, got me a little water. He said, Keith, sit down. And then something fascinating. I'm going to interview him, and he says to me, Keith, tell me about yourself. I want to get to know you. Through the conversation, here's what I got. He was very quiet, very unassuming, and very solid. Now think of this way. When you think about charismatic, boisterous, hey, look at me and how wonderful I am kind of leaders, when you think about charisma, we get inspired by charisma. We go, oh my God, what a wonderful leader. How brilliant that person is. We love to be near their glow. It turns out that very few of these leaders had that charisma. Very, very few. More of them were like Banas. Quiet, understated. This isn't about me. This is about what we're doing together. There was so little emphasis on him and so much about the business that they're creating. That sense of self is the opposite of that boisterous bravado. You know, when you think about people who are arrogant, and we talked about this at the table a little bit, who have this sense of, I know the answer, I'm wonderful, I'm bright, what's underneath that bravado? What's underneath macho? Hey, look how wonderful I am. Insecurity. Who said insecurity? Yeah. What's underneath solid, calm confidence is an inner sense of self. That's what Banas was showing me. By the way, because many of you are entrepreneurs and you're starting up your businesses and you want to grow it, the other thing that he showed me is a clear map. He said, let me tell you my plan for Bevmo. He said, first, it's going to be centered around the customers. And in order to be centered around the customers, we need to do this and we needed to do that. And our plan for the next year is to move from bankruptcy into modest profitability, and that's all. And to orient around the customer. Year 2, once we get there, we're going to establish more efficient operations and get even more profitable. Again, centered around the customer, so that every customer who walks into our store has the following experience. Once we get there, year 3, we're going to do this. He was a little bit like a manager of a team, of a sports team that for 20 years was a terrible team. And the manager comes in and says, we are not going to get to the pinnacle. We're not going to get to the championship next year. We're going to get to the championship 5 years from now. Here's our plan little by little. His quiet, solid determination reflected this third quality that I'm referring to. It reflected a rock-solid sense of self. I like to think of it as self-esteem on steroids, meaning so solid that there's nothing to scream, there's nothing to brag about, there's nothing about, hey, look at me, who I am, because I'm already solid inside. They're clear, these leaders were clear about their unique gifts, and this may be connected to what you're saying. They're not brilliant leaders in all situations. They're just clear about what they're good at in this situation. And they're good with that. It's like knowing oneself and being good with oneself. And that results in much greater openness, curiosity. Instead of I know the answer, I'm solid enough in myself that I'm curious about other people's answers. It results in a greater ease and flow. It results in emotional intelligence. It gives room for other people to be themselves. So here's what I'm saying, bottom line. All those leadership qualities that we named are driven by something much deeper. A sense of self, a sense of integrity of who one is, a sense of passion for making a difference in the world. And what gives rise to that? I don't know. I don't know. I like to think that it's a little bit of our birthright for us to have these qualities, but it's not so, it's oftentimes masked through pain and suffering over years and years. But if you can dig deep and find your passion and grow your business from the passion, if you can find out who am I in the matter and stay solid to who you are, you have a half of a chance of growing a meaningful business. This won't get you through the startup, because through the startup, you're gonna have to get a good product, you gotta have a good idea, you gotta have drive, and you gotta get it out there. But if you succeed after the startup, then the question has to be asked and answered, what am I building beyond the startup? Am I building something meaningful in the world that's going to add value? And am I going to build an organization that can sustain itself? And then all of a sudden, those things that you may not think about in the first 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden these things start to matter a lot. Because in order to get to later growth, you have to create a sustainable system built on integrity and on trust and a desire for people to stay in the game and go through hard times. And that's when your leadership is going to matter the most. It's not something entrepreneurs care about early on. I know. They don't hire me in their first year or two of life. A, they can't afford me, and B, they're just struggling just to survive. And when you're survival mode, you don't think very long term. You don't think about the culture too much. You don't think about your leadership. But if you make it, then your leadership, your conduct matters more than anything. If you're the center of attention and everything revolves around you, and you're a 100 or 200 person organization, you can't sustain yourself. I know I'm making a generalization that you'll find an example that's not true. You'll find Stephen Jobs or somebody like that it's very centered around Stephen Jobs. But most organizations don't get to later growth when the organization is centered around the individual. It's got to be centered around the culture, centered around the strategy, centered around the people of the organization, and centered around the customer. The great leaders that I met, it no longer was centered on themselves. Driven by a core belief, but focused on the outer need. Anyway, I'll stop now. That's what I wanted to share with you, and I'd love to hear more questions and thoughts. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
As I hear all the leadership traits and qualities and the attributes, and I'm just wondering, and pardon me for asking this, so have you thought yourself as if, where do I stand on the benchmark?
Of great leaders. Well, here's an interesting paradox, that most great leaders don't think of themselves as great leaders. You know, one of the things, and this happened, Jerry Jampolsky was the first one that I met. And actually, Chauncey Starr was that as well. So here's the paradox. It's a great paradox. I said to Chauncey, the 93-year-old guy that I spoke about, hey, I understand you're a great leader. And this is partly why I'm here with you. The first thing out of his mouth was, I don't know that I'm such a great leader. He said, in fact, I don't think about it. I don't think about becoming a great leader. I think about how do I make a difference in the world. He said, I think about solving big problems. And that's what I care about. I don't know if I'm a great leader. And then Jerry Jampolsky, he invited me to his house and I spent a bunch of time with him. He said, I don't think of myself as a great leader. What? You're interested in great leadership, Keith. I'm not. I'm interested in just simply doing my good work. And so the paradox is a lot of these people didn't care about whether they were thought about great leaders or not. It wasn't their ambition. There was an enormous humility about themselves because their focus was something outside of themselves. What's shifted for me, and can you imagine every 2 weeks of your life for 2 hours sitting with a great leader for 2 years? Can you imagine what that would do with your life? It would just transform your life. That's what happened for me. Because truthfully, 10 years ago, I wanted to be a great leader. I wanted to be a great consultant. I wanted accolade, I wanted all the juju that comes. And from that place, I couldn't become a great leader. So my answer to you is, I don't know. What I do know is I care about what we're talking about, and I wanted to contribute to the world. And I'll let somebody else, God or the earth, the world, determine whether, I don't know. I think I'm better than I was before, though. I think so. Yeah. Sir.
No, so I like the set of questions that you asked in the beginning. And while I confess that I didn't know many people in your list, some of the people that sprung to my mind as great leaders were not up there. So I was kind of wondering, to pick random names, non-parochially, I guess Nelson Mandela.
It's hard to do.
Nelson Mandela and Elon Musk, I think, are two good leaders.
Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Musk, maybe, yeah. It's got Stephen Jobs kind of energy, and I have questions about it. But yeah, maybe. Yeah, those would be good candidates. So what's the question?
So the question is, there seems to be, and maybe this will happen if you sort of pick random people in the room, but
Yeah.
So people, I thought, you can throw in people like Bill Gates, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So people who sort of are obviously in my mind in that list were not at all in
Yeah.
that list. So
So what do I make of that?
I'm trying to sort of figure out the disparity there.
Well, yeah. So there is. So here's the disparity. Do you know Elon Musk?
I've met him, yes.
But do you know him?
No, I don't.
Yeah. Do you know Nelson Mandela?
No.
Yeah. So I think that some of these people that we might name as great leaders because of their public persona, some of them may or may not be named by the people in their organization as a great leader, but their public persona, they're really good press. My guess is Warren Buffett would pass this test as an example.
He'd be another person.
I think so. The people I know who know Warren Buffett speak extraordinary about that man's groundedness and his values. He'd be on my list. I just didn't have the good fortune of somebody that I know name him. So the only way I make sense of that for me is, first of all, maybe I'm not so connected as I said I was. Maybe a lot of these people don't know them well, because I did make the criteria, not do you know of them or have you met them, but do you know them and have worked with them closely to the point that you could say in front of all of you all, yes, this person is an extraordinary leader. So the criteria was that. And second, I think my definition of a great leader is somebody who is creating conditions where others can thrive. And where the quality of their leadership is kind of like creates a container within which that can give rise to the greatness in the lives of the people around them. And what it takes to become that kind of leader is not the same kind of ambition that it takes to become the leaders of great companies that are in the press. So my hypothesis, and I have no way of testing this out, or at least I'm not sure I want to test it out, but what it takes to rise the corporate ladder of huge companies is often enormous ambition and enormous desire for power. And a lot of these leaders were not driven by that. And so what happens is that people look at some of these leaders that are in the press. I don't think Nelson Mandela would be one of them. But they look at a lot of the people that are in the press and they get to know them, and they find out that these are not leaders that fit the criteria that I just named, because their ambition is so big it drives them to these big things. They become leaders of these powerful organizations. They become powerful, but they don't meet the test that their people say, wow, I'm so grateful I worked with them, and so are the thousands and thousands of other people. So that's my guess. And it could be my own biases that are getting in the way. I don't know. Yeah.
I just have a comment to offer. It's fair to say that unfortunately leadership is such a topic, there is no universal definition. And these attributes are all qualitative, which is what, in my opinion, makes it very fascinating.
Yes,
Like,
yes, yes.
If it were mathematical, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
Yeah.
Having said that, in my opinion, leadership ceases to exist in the absence of followership. So the best way to really find out if somebody is a good leader is through the eyes and words and mouths of followers rather than interviewing leaders themselves. You can get the traits of leadership by talking to leaders
Yeah.
based on their interpretation.
Yeah.
But a true leader, in my humble opinion, is determined by the followership, not leadership.
A lot of drug lords have a lot of followers. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
No, but they will say different things.
Yeah. So I think that would be a wonderful study to do. Part of my inspiration is I wanted to sit with them. I wanted to experience them directly. So it was partly what they said in the
They
interview.
do well with their first reports. I've seen leaders that do well with their first report, not necessarily with the second report.
Yeah.
Not necessarily with
Also true. Yeah. So yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I wasn't inspired to do that. I wanted to meet them personally, and so I got that experience, and it was wonderful in that respect. Yes, sir.
So Adam Mankaria was the CEO of St. Regis Group, my father.
Yeah.
And my question is twofold. One, do you think that in today's world, we have a lot of politicians in high offices, but not necessarily they exhibit the same type of leadership that you're talking
Yes.
about? And if yes, why? Why is it that people get to the offices only if they have ambition but not enough compassion?
So here's the dilemma or the paradox about it. In government and in major corporations, it's usually fueled by people who are driven by their needs for power. Usually there's something, the people that play politics, they have a high power drive. There's a guy by the name of McClellan, David McClellan. He did this body of research that I think is directly germane to this and fascinating. He was, in the 60s and 70s, he was the head of the Psychology and Social Relations Department at Harvard. And he did a body of research around motivation. And basically what he found is most people are driven by three primary motives, three primary needs. The needs for affiliation, the need for achievement, and the need for power, or influence, if you don't like the word power. And we all have all three embedded in us, but to varying degrees. He said, interestingly, the need for power has two faces to it. Power for one's own self and power to make a difference in the world. So here's my point and my thought about this, is a lot of people who become leaders of major organizations because of their ambition are very power-driven. And part of what kind of causes us to gag about these very same people is often the ambition seems to be about themselves. They're not taking their power and directing it for the greater good of the world. They play politics and they schmooze and they glad hand and they do these things behind the scenes. It feels like it doesn't have integrity. It's a rare politician, and there are movies made about these things like there's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This is a movie by Jimmy Stewart in the 40s, and it's about a guy who just pure integrity. He's a former teacher, and he just goes to Washington, D.C. and says, you know, I don't like any of you. You're all just playing games with each other, and where is the integrity in the country? And when you're power-driven for one's own self, you start to play games, politics, in the negative sense of politics. The paradox is that a lot of these leaders were power-driven as well, but so focused on the needs of the world that they weren't playing the politics that we're now talking about. They were playing leadership with integrity. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a rarity, my bias. I'm sure there are still political leaders who demonstrate the contrary, but they're so few that when they exist, like Mahatma Gandhi, who was, by the way, quite power-driven, but it was driven to make a difference in the world. And Nelson Mandela, very power-driven guy, but so much in service to the world that we say that's a wonderful power. And he exuded it in such a modest way because it wasn't focused on himself. And I just think that's a rarity. The two faces of power answers the question, in order to play politics, you've got to have some power drive. To play mature politics, which is a rarity, maturity has something to do with focusing on the needs of the whole. Does that make sense? Too much of them play an immature form of power, unfortunately, even in leadership of companies, yes.
So during your research and your meetings with these leaders, what was the surprising finding or learning?
I think that there were probably two or three. To call it research is a little bit more like my quest. I don't know that the research would pass a dissertation committee. It wasn't, that solidly founded, but I call it research. It was a study of sorts. But my journey in meeting these leaders. First of all, the biggest surprise was the impact on me. I was no spring chicken when I started this. I was about 48 years old. And I didn't realize how it would cook me so powerfully. I was in tears with many of these leaders, not just by what they said, but how they were showing up with me. And so it just moved me extraordinarily. I'd say a second thing was how quiet they were. The humility was extraordinary to me. A few of them were charismatic. Some of you may know of Stephen Newberry. He's a pretty charismatic guy. He was formerly CEO of Lamb Research. He's a pretty charismatic guy. He's got some of that big ego kind of stuff. But he too, his humility and grace, at least in my experience, was quite astounding, as were 95% of these folks. And so I started to wonder about what is humble leadership and how do you bring humility to a powerful game? So there are these paradoxes that are quite evident for me. Let me see if there's anything else that, I love the question. Well, this was kind of the discovery, and I think I'll show it to you here, just briefly. Didn't know I was, here we go, I got the clicker. This little model came for me, and I shared it with you. In order to be a great leader, you need to be inner-driven, not outer-driven. In other words, you can't be pleasing other people, trying to do good for them and do good for them and do for them. You've got to have an inner compass. That's crucial. That inner compass has Mimi Silbert say, in my home, you follow these rules or you're out. But paradoxically, your focus needs to be on others. Inner-driven, outer-focused. That paradox was not evident to me. When I share with people like you all, you kind of go, yeah, I get it. Because so many people that are inner-driven are also inner-focused. And so many people who are outer-focused are also outer-driven, and they end up moving around too much without that core solid sense of self. To find that inner drive with an intention to make a difference in the world, that's a magical combination. Everything else, so other focused and outer driven is too caretaking, trying to please everybody. When you're outer driven but self-focused, you get inconsistent and flighty. When you're self-focused and inner driven, it's self-serving. And so to me, the only game in town is to be inner-driven and outer-focused. That requires you do your inner work, you get solid with yourself, and then serve the world. That magical combination, maybe that was the discovery. I'm aware it's a little bit after 8:30. I'm happy to hang around. Got one more thought or question?
Yeah, so have you thought of differentiating between great leaders and good leaders?
To me, this does. To me, this is from good to great.
Because many times, many corporate great leaders end up being the victim of their own greatness, and then they fall.
Yeah, yeah. Especially if they get too arrogant. They're
Greedy or arrogant or-
yeah, yeah. Anyway, I thank you for your time. I'll hang around and spend time with you afterwards if you like.
I
And,
would love to talk to you.
yeah. Thank you very much.